white paint on a nursery crib was supposed to be safe, advertised as protective, sanitary, pure. But that paint was made with lead carbonate, and the children who chewed the rail or breathed the dust developed seizures, stunted growth, irreversible brain damage. The metal that raised America, that lined its aqueducts, sweetened its wine, and silenced its engines, was never tested before it was sold. The cost was not paid in currency. It was paid in cognition. Welcome to the Deep Archive. We leave the surface of familiar history and seal the hatch behind us. Pressure builds. A narrow beam cuts through the dark, illuminating what was filed away. A paintbrush, a lead pipe, a filing cabinet full of ghost-written studies, a child's tooth holding a permanent record. The evidence waits below the reach of daylight. The metal that raised America did not disappear. It stayed in the bones, and the bones remember everything. Chapter 1 begins now. The tunnel is darker than any room with its light extinguished. The only sound is water, a slow, measured drip that falls from stone onto lead sheeting, each drop a tiny hammer striking the same note. The air smells of wet rock and rust, but the rust is not iron. It is the silver sweat of a metal that does not corrode the way others do. It stays, it waits, and it drinks the water that passes over it. Roman engineers built this system 2,000 years ago. They lined the aqueducts with lead because it was soft enough to bend into shape and hard enough to hold its form under pressure. They laid lead pipes beneath the streets of the empire's cities, joining them with molten lead, sealing the joints with the same metal. The word they used for it was plumbum, and from that word we took our word for the trade that carries water into homes, plumbing. The name alone is a confession we never meant to make. The water that ran through those pipes was not immediately poisoned. Hard water deposits calcium carbonate, which coats the interior of lead pipes and slows the leaching. But not every aqueduct carried hard water. Not every joint was perfectly sealed. And the water that sat overnight in a lead pipe, the first water drawn in the morning, carried a measurable concentration of the metal, not enough to kill in a single draft, enough to accumulate, enough to rewrite the chemistry of the body one sip at a time. The strange part was not that the Romans noticed nothing. The strange part was that they noticed something else, something that made the metal seem even more valuable. Lead acetate forms when lead reacts with acidic liquids. It tastes sweet, and Rome, like every empire, had a taste for sweetness. They called it sapa or defrutum, wine boiled down in lead pots until it thickened into a syrup. Cooks added it to sauces, to preserved fruits, to the wine itself. The elites drank it from goblets that were themselves turned on lead-tipped lathes. The sweetness was real. So was the compound that caused it. Lead acetate does not break down in the body. It travels through the gut into the bloodstream, binds to enzymes that require calcium or zinc, and slowly replaces them. It mimics essential minerals while disabling the systems that depend on them. The record shows a delicacy. The chemistry shows a cost. Historians have long debated whether lead poisoning contributed to the erratic behavior of certain Roman emperors. Caligula's paranoia, Nero's theatrical cruelty, the chronic infertility, stillbirths, and cognitive decline that haunted the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The evidence is circumstantial but consistent. The upper classes consumed the most lead, sweetened wine, painted walls, cosmetic powders, cooking vessels, and the upper classes produced the most documented madness. The disease was not written as a diagnosis. It was written as character, as depravity, as divine punishment. But under the microscope, it looks like chemistry. The paradox was quiet at first. Lead was cheap, abundant, and obedient. It let engineers build cities that could hold water. It let cooks preserve sweetness. It let painters cover walls in the color of power. But obedience is not safety. The metal did not rebel. It simply did what metals do. It stayed in the tissues of the people who handled it, who drank from it, who ate from it, who breathed the dust of it. It did not announce itself. There was no taste, no smell, no immediate pain. There was only a slow erosion of capacity, of coordination, of reasoning, of impulse control. The civilization that built itself on lead was also being dissolved by it, from the inside, generation after generation. Rome did not fall because of lead. Empires collapsed for many reasons, not one. But the metal contributed something important, a steady, undiagnosed drag on the collective mind, a neurological tax levied on the very people who made decisions, a hidden invoice that came due not in currency, but in competence. The aqueducts still stand in places. The tunnels are empty now, or nearly so, but the drip continues somewhere deeper than the stone. It falls onto lead that was laid down 2,000 years ago, and the lead has not changed. It does not age. It does not disappear. It is the same metal it was when the empire was building its greatest works. And the story is not over. The silver sweat did not stop at the borders of Rome. It would be mined again, refined again, and spread into the air, into the soil, into the water, into the bones of every future city. But that is a later chapter. For now, listen. The drip is slower than a heartbeat. It has been falling longer than any empire. It will continue falling long after the last listener is gone. The faint scent of old paint in a closed room is a smell that lingers long after the brush dries. It is chalky, slightly sweet, like dust that once was wet. In the 18th century, that smell meant something good. It meant a house was finished, protected, made bright. White lead paint, a simple paste of lead carbonate ground into linseed oil, became the most valued coating in America. It covered the walls of parlors, the trim of doors, the wood of cribs. The color was pure, opaque, almost luminous. It stood for cleanliness, for prosperity, for the kind of home a rising nation wanted to present to the world. But the whiteness was a mask. To make that paint, men worked in a process that looked like alchemy and smelled like rot. The stack method required rows of earthen pots filled with vinegar, layered with scrap lead, and buried under heaps of horse manure. The manure fermented, producing heat and carbon dioxide. The vinegar corroded the lead into acetate. The CO2 converted it into carbonate. After weeks in the warm, dark stacks, the lead had become a white crust, soft, heavy, ready to be scraped off and ground into pigment. The workers who tended these stacks breathed the fumes of vinegar, manure, and lead day after day. They developed cramps in the gut, what the trade called painter's colic, and their hands began to tremble. Palsy was so common that it was not considered a warning. It was considered the cost of the job. The strangest part was not that the poison worked. It was that the poison looked like virtue. The white paint was advertised as protective, durable, sanitary. It sealed wood from rot. It reflected light. It made a nursery feel clean. And so it was painted onto windowsills where children leaned, onto crib rails that babies chewed, onto toys painted with cheerful faces. The lead did not announce itself. It had no taste, no immediate burn. It simply waited. By the early 1900s, a few pediatricians began to notice something wrong. In well-to-do homes, the very homes that could afford the best paint, children were falling ill with strange neurological symptoms. Irritability, stunted growth, seizures. The medical journals of the time described these cases with careful language, cerebral irritation of unknown cause. But the cause was not unknown. It was sitting on the windowsill, flaking into dust, settling onto the toys, into the carpet, into the small hands that went to the mouth. The body keeps its own books. Lead is not broken down or excreted efficiently. It travels from the lungs or the gut into the blood, and from the blood into bone and soft tissue. In a child's developing brain, it interferes with the formation of synapses, the pruning of connections, the delicate architecture of learning and impulse control. The damage is irreversible. The dose does not have to be large. It only has to be steady, a thin layer of paint, slowly turning into a fine dust, breathed in over months and years. The pattern was not hidden. It was documented, published, discussed at medical meetings. But the paint was too profitable, too ingrained in the building industry, too well loved by homeowners who believed they were protecting their children with every fresh coat. The Lead Industries Association, formed in 1928, began a campaign of reassurance. They funded studies that found no conclusive proof. They sent pamphlets to doctors. They argued that the real danger was not lead, but poor hygiene. They branded concern as hysteria. Meanwhile, the paint dried. The windowsills held their bright white surface. The children grew, and the lead stayed in the bones, a permanent record of a good intention turned slow poison. The house that was supposed to be safe had become a pharmacy of damage, dosing out one invisible particle at a time. The room that was meant to be a child's first world, bright, clean, protected, was instead a silent engineering of harm. The paint did not scream. It simply shed. And it would take decades before the law caught up with what the pediatricians already knew. The ban on lead in residential paint came in 1978, more than 50 years after the first clear warnings. By then, millions of homes had been painted, repainted, sanded, and scraped. The dust had settled into the soil around foundations, into the carpets of generations, into the lungs and the blood of children whose only crime was to live in a house that looked like safety. The chalky scent of old paint in a closed room is not a perfume. It is a signature, faint, patient, still waiting to be read. The engine knock was a mechanical confession. Inside the cylinder, fuel burned unevenly, compressing in wild pockets, detonating against the piston's rhythm, a sharp percussive ping that shook the chassis and wasted power. In 1921, that sound was the enemy of progress. Automobiles were stuttering, struggling to climb hills without shuddering, and the industry had spent years searching for a way to quiet the knock without rebuilding every engine on the road. The man who answered the question was Thomas Midgley Jr., a mechanical engineer working for General Motors. He was young, inventive, and convinced that the answer lay not in the engine itself, but in the chemistry of the fuel. He tested compounds the way a pharmacist tests tinctures, systematically, patiently, until he found a molecule that made the knock disappear. Tetraethyl lead. 4 carbon atoms, 1 lead atom, and a set of ethyl groups that turned volatile gasoline into smooth, predictable combustion. The engine ran quieter. The horsepower climbed. The future, for a moment, looked clean. Midgley gave the additive a name that carried no chemical weight: ethyl. It sounded like a breath, a soft vowel, a friendly neighbor. It was a word you could say without tasting metal. And for the next 70 years, that name would appear on pumps across America, on billboards and in magazines, on the lips of children who never knew they were inhaling a neurotoxin with every bus ride to school. The strange part was not that the additive worked. It worked brilliantly. The strange part was that nobody in the marketing department seemed to ask what happened to the lead after it left the tailpipe. The lead did not vanish. It oxidized, formed fine particles, and drifted into the air, into the soil, into the lungs of every person who lived near a road. The particle was small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier. The engine knock was silenced, but the silence was not peace. In 1924, less than 3 years after Midgley's discovery, the human cost became impossible to ignore. At Standard Oil's Tetraethyl lead plant in New Jersey, workers began to fall. Not from a fall, their minds fell first. They saw things that were not there. "Little black bats," one man said, before his legs gave out and his speech dissolved into nonsense. Others became violent, thrashing against the walls of the building they had walked into that morning as healthy men. By the time the outbreak ended, 5 workers were dead, and dozens more had been permanently damaged. The plant was a laboratory of tragedy, but the company did not close it. They blamed the workers. Carelessness, they said. Failure to follow procedure. The chemical formula remained a trade secret. The body keeps its own books, and the books for those men read clearly, lead absorbed through the skin, through the lungs, through the simple act of breathing inside a room where fine particles hung in the air like dust over a gravel road. The symptoms were called insanity, but the microscope showed a different story: a metal infiltrating the nervous system, dismantling the brain cell by cell. The mind was not unhinged. It was dissolved. The discovery did not stop the production. It accelerated the public relations campaign. The Lead Industries Association, which had already spent decades fighting the truth about white paint, now turned its attention to gasoline. They funded studies that found no harm. They ghost-wrote editorials that called safety concerns hysteria. They placed their confidence not in science, but in the slow erosion of attention that happens when a problem is distributed across millions of lives over decades. No single child could be blamed for breathing. No single driver could be held responsible for the air he consumed while driving to work. The poison was collective, and collective responsibility is the easiest debt to ignore. By the time the United States banned lead in gasoline for on-road vehicles in 1996, an estimated 7 million tons of lead had been burned and released into the atmosphere. That number is not abstract. It settled on soil, on sidewalks, in the dust of every urban playground. It settled in the bones of children whose developing brains absorbed it more readily than adults. The knock had been silenced, and in its place came a quieter catastrophe, a generation of lowered IQ, increased impulse disorders, and a statistical drift away from cognitive potential that researchers would spend decades trying to measure, knowing they could never recover the losses. The irony is that Midgley himself understood the danger. He had suffered lead poisoning during his own experiments, and he knew the symptoms from the inside. He did not stop. His invention made him wealthy, made General Motors powerful, and made the automobile industry possible at a price that would not appear on any invoice. He went on to develop chlorofluorocarbons for refrigeration, another molecule that solved one problem and created a global atmospheric wound. He died in 1944, before the full ledger of his contributions could be tallied. The car door closes in the dark garage. The engine ticks as it cools. For a moment, the air is still. Then the engine starts again, somewhere else, on a street you cannot see, and the cycle repeats. The knock is gone, but the lead remains. In the soil under the road, in the paint on the garage wall, in the bones of the child who played in the driveway 40 years ago. The air is clear now, but the body remembers. The room was never meant to be seen. A basement archive in a building that no longer remembers its own business address. Metal filing cabinets in long rows. The paint, the color of old bone. The air conditioner hums a steady note, a mechanical respiration that has outlived every human complaint. Inside the cabinets, the paper has yellowed at the edges, the ink gone brown and quiet. The records are complete. That is the terrible thing. They were never lost. They were never destroyed. They were simply locked away, and the lock was never picked. By the 1920s, Dr. Alice Hamilton had already written the warnings. She was America's first great occupational health researcher, a woman who walked into battery plants and smelter communities with a notebook and a clinical gaze that saw what others refused to see. She documented lead poisoning in workers who could no longer hold a spoon, who spoke of numb hands and a dull pressure behind the eyes, who died young with their bones heavy with metal. She published her findings in scientific journals, in government reports, in language precise enough to be indisputable. She did not accuse, she simply described, and that was enough to make her dangerous. The Lead Industries Association was formed in 1928. It was not a conspiracy in the theatrical sense. It was a trade organization with a budget and a public relations firm. Its members did not deny that lead was toxic. They simply argued that it was not that toxic, not in the amounts people actually encountered, not unless you were careless, not unless you were already weak. The strategy was not to refute the science. The strategy was to make the science seem uncertain, to fund studies that produced convenient conclusions, to ghostwrite editorials for medical journals and plant them under the names of cooperative physicians, to send pamphlets to pediatricians explaining that lead paint on cribs was safe as long as the child did not chew the wood. The truth was not buried. It was filed under the wrong name. The strange part was not that the industry lied. The strange part was how long the lie worked. From the 1920s to the 1970s, the same conversation repeated itself like a stuck valve. A researcher would publish evidence of harm. The association would respond with a press release, a funded counter-study, a letter to the editor. The public would forget. The hearings would be postponed. The standard would be delayed. The gap between first clear warnings and regulatory action spanned nearly 6 decades. A child born in 1920, painted crib, leaded air, leaded pipes, could be a grandparent by the time the paint ban finally arrived in 1978. The body keeps its own books, and the books are not kind. The archive of denial is not a single room. It is a distributed collection. The minutes of industry meetings where the word hysteria was used to describe concerned mothers. The trade journal articles praising lead as a civilizing metal. The signed agreements between corporations and academic laboratories, promising funding in exchange for favorable language in the discussion section. The carbon copies of letters to politicians, assuring them that the science was still unsettled, that more research was needed, that a ban would be premature. The paper is thin, the ink is stable, the air conditioner hums on. What made the campaign so effective was not sophistication but repetition. The same message delivered every year to every audience until it became background noise. Lead poisoning was a problem of the past when people were careless. Lead poisoning was a problem of the poor who did not maintain their homes. Lead poisoning was a problem of the foreign factories, not our own. Each deflection bought another year of production. Each year of production deposited another layer of lead into the soil, the dust, the lungs of children who would never read the memos. The paradox, if you can call it that, is that the industry was not evil in the cinematic sense. It was ordinary. It was a room of men in suits who believed they were defending a useful product, a profitable industry, a way of life. They did not see themselves as poisoners. They saw themselves as realists. The science was inconvenient. The cost of change was high. The simplest thing was to slow the process, to blur the edges, to let the lawyers handle the rest. And it worked. For 60 years it worked. The archive does not forgive. It does not judge either. It simply waits. The paper sits in its cabinet, the ink dry, the words still legible. The light from a single fluorescent tube flickers once, twice, then steadies. There is no dramatic ending here. No courtroom confession, no repentant executive, no single moment when the truth finally broke through. The truth had been available all along. The problem was not that the science was hidden. The problem was that the science was heard, and then filed, and then forgotten, and then heard again, and then filed again, and then forgotten again. It took until 1978 to ban lead in residential paint. It took until 1996 to ban lead in gasoline for on-road vehicles. The gap between the first clear warning and the last legal sale was not a failure of knowledge. It was a triumph of organized patience. The industry did not need to win every argument. It only needed to win the argument that mattered most, the argument about when to act. And the answer, for 60 years, was always the same: not yet, not yet, not yet. The room is still there. The cabinets are still full. The air conditioner hums. Somewhere, a researcher who does not know the history is opening a drawer for the first time. The paper is yellow. The words are brown, but they are still clear. And the story they tell is not a mystery. It is an invoice. It was always an invoice. And the bill, as the children of Flint would one day discover, does not expire. The sound of a tap turning on somewhere in the Midwest. A thin stream of water runs into a sink, clear, odorless, ordinary. Then a slow drip, a pause, another drip. The rhythm of a leak that has been waiting underground for decades in a pipe made of lead. The city of Flint, Michigan, sits on the Flint River. In 2014, seeking to save money, officials switched the municipal water source from Lake Huron to the river. The water was not treated with corrosion inhibitors. It was a chemical oversight that seemed minor at the time. But the river water was more acidic than the lake water, and it began to eat away at the inner walls of the old lead service lines that connected the mains to the city's homes. The pipes had been laid in the early 20th century, during a boom of infrastructure built on the assumption that lead was a neutral material, durable, cheap, easy to shape. The assumption was wrong. The water pulled lead ions from the pipe walls and carried them into kitchens, bathrooms, drinking glasses, baby bottles. For months, the city insisted the water was safe. Tests were mishandled, thresholds were overlooked, voices were dismissed. Then a local pediatrician, Mona Hanna, Atisha, noticed that blood lead levels in Flint's children had spiked after the switch. Her findings were met with denial, then delay, then grudging acknowledgement. By the time the water source was changed back, tens of thousands of residents had been exposed. The crisis was not new. It was a delayed echo of every earlier chapter in this story. A city built on lead pipes, a population that trusted its infrastructure, an institution that chose convenience over verification. The same metal that had sweetened Roman wine and painted Victorian nurseries and boosted engine compression now flowed through the plumbing of a struggling American city, silent, invisible, patient. The damage was already done, locked into bones and brains before the first apology was issued. Lead does not degrade. Unlike organic toxins that break down in sunlight or soil, lead is an element. It enters the environment and stays there. It settles in dust on windowsills, in the soil of old industrial lots, in the sediment of riverbeds. It is taken up by plants, ingested by animals, inhaled by children playing in bare earth near a former smelter. And once inside the human body, it does not leave easily. Most of it is stored in the skeleton, where it replaces calcium in the mineral lattice of bone. The skeleton becomes an archive. Layer by layer, year by year, the body writes its own environmental history. Archaeologists know this. They measure historical lead exposure by analyzing the bones of the dead. A femur from the Roman Empire shows a certain concentration. A rib from Victorian London shows a spike. A tooth from a child who lived during the peak of leaded gasoline shows a level that would be considered poisoning by modern standards. The bones do not lie. They are a ledger written in hydroxyapatite, a permanent record of what the air, the water, the food contained. The Industrial Revolution is there. The paint boom is there. The gasoline age is there, all inscribed in the bodies of those who lived through them. The strange part is not that the metal persists, it is that we knew it would. By the 1920s, researchers had already documented the way lead accumulates in the skeleton. They knew that it could be detected in the bones of people who had not worked with lead, only breathed the city air. They knew that it could cross the placenta and enter the developing brain of a fetus. They knew all of this. But the knowledge was filed away in the same archives where the Lead Industries Association stored its ghost-written editorials. The science was clear, but the cost of acting on it was high. So the bones kept accumulating, and the pipes kept leaching, and the children kept breathing. The disease has no fever. It does not announce itself with a cough or a rash. It works slowly, by interfering with the enzymes that build blood and the receptors that wire the brain. The early signs are easy to miss. Irritability, a slight drop in IQ, a shorter attention span. These are the symptoms of poverty, of poor nutrition, of countless other stressors, and they are also the symptoms of chronic lead exposure. The metal does not announce its presence. It just makes the world a little harder to navigate, a little more frustrating, a little more exhausting. The burden falls heaviest on those who already have the least. In Flint, the water is now considered safe again, treated with phosphates to coat the pipes and prevent further corrosion. But the pipes themselves are still there, beneath the streets, under the lawns, inside the walls. The phosphate coating is a temporary patch. The lead is not gone. It is waiting, not with intention, but with the indifference of a metal that has no plans, no politics, no regrets. It simply exists, the same way it has existed since it was smelted from ore a century ago. The mark left by a civilization that chose convenience over cognition is not written in books or monuments. It is written in the bones of its children, in the slow drip of a tap that cannot be turned off, in the soil of every city that ran on leaded gasoline and painted its walls with white lead and built its homes on lead pipes. The metal that raised America is still here, not as a memory, but as a fact. The tap runs. The drip continues. Somewhere deep underground, an old lead pipe is still waiting. The drip continues. It fell through Roman aqueducts, through Victorian nurseries painted white, through the tailpipes of a century of cars, through the pipes beneath Flint. What was found below was not a mystery waiting to be solved, but a debt waiting to be recognized. The truth that became visible is this: the metal that raised America was never a villain in a story. It was a tool, useful and sweet, that quietly entered the bones of those who trusted it. The paradox that remains is that we built our civilization on a substance that slowly dismantled the minds of our children, our leaders, our workers. And the cost could no longer be hidden once the evidence changed from hypothesis to a child's blood test, from a medical journal to a skeleton in an archaeological dig. The evidence did not change the past. It changed what we can pretend not to know. The pressure eases from the hull as the archive file closes. The darkness thins above, black water turning blue. The hatch opens, and cold sea air enters the lungs. Some substances are safest when they remain evidence, not experience. If this kind of quiet descent into science and history is what you came for, you can subscribe to the Deep Archive. The drip is still falling somewhere, but now we listen differently.